When they threw Dr. Elena Vasquez's leather-bound journal into the flames that December evening, they thought they were destroying the ramblings of a disgraced academic. They had no idea they were about to trigger a chain of events that would bring 3 warring nations to their knees within 72 hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smoke rising from the courtyard of the Institute for Advanced Linguistics carried with it more than just burning paper and ink. Hidden within those pages were sequences of words so precisely crafted, so mathematically perfect in their arrangement, that they possessed a power most of the scientific community had dismissed as pure fantasy. Elena had spent 12 years of her life proving that language itself could be weaponized, that certain combinations of syllables and phrases could bypass rational thought and tap directly into the most primal parts of the human brain. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been the laughingstock of academic circles for the better part of a decade. Once a respected professor of cognitive linguistics at the prestigious Meridian University, her career had taken a dramatic turn when she published her controversial paper titled The Neurological Architecture of Linguistic Triggers. The academic community had torn her work apart, calling it pseudoscience and comparing it to medieval alchemy. Her colleagues whispered behind her back about her descent into madness, about how the death of her brother in the ongoing conflict between Karelia and Vanthia had broken something fundamental in her mind. But Elena had never stopped believing in her research. While other linguists focused on traditional grammar and syntax, she delved deeper into the intersection of neuroscience and language. She studied ancient texts from civilizations that had mysteriously collapsed overnight, examining patterns in their final written records. She analyzed the speeches of historical figures who had managed to rally entire populations with seemingly simple words. Most importantly, she investigated reports of verbal commands that had caused mass surrenders in various conflicts throughout history, incidents that military historians had always attributed to coincidence or propaganda. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her journal, bound in dark brown leather and secured with a brass clasp, contained 15 years of painstaking research. Every page was filled with her precise handwriting, documenting experiments, mapping neural pathways and recording the exact phonetic combinations that could trigger specific emotional and psychological responses in human subjects. The work was so advanced, so far ahead of its time, that even Elena herself sometimes questioned whether she had stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist in the hands of any individual. The journal's pages contained detailed maps of what Elena called cognitive vulnerabilities, specific sequences of words that could bypass the brain's normal defensive mechanisms and plant suggestions directly into the subconscious. She had identified 17 distinct trigger patterns, each capable of producing different effects ranging from immediate compliance to long-term behavioral modification. Her most dangerous discovery was what she termed cascade phrases, word combinations that could spread from person to person like a linguistic virus, carrying their effects through verbal transmission alone. Elena had been particularly fascinated by the conflict between her home country of Karelia and its neighboring nations, Vanthia and the Moria. The three-way war had been raging for over 2 decades, fueled by territorial disputes, resource conflicts, and deep-seated cultural animosities that seemed impossible to resolve through traditional diplomacy. Hundreds of thousands had died, entire cities had been reduced to rubble, and a generation had grown up knowing nothing but violence and hatred. What made Elena's situation even more precarious was her family's connection to the conflict. Her brother Marcus had been a decorated colonel in the Karelian military, known for his tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty to his country. His death 3 years earlier in a Vanthian ambush had devastated Elena, but it had also provided her with unexpected access to military communications and strategic documents. Marcus had believed in his sister's work, and before his death, he had secretly provided her with recordings of interrogations, surrender negotiations, and battlefield communications from all 3 warring nations. The Institute for Advanced Linguistics, where Elena conducted her research, had initially supported her work with enthusiasm. The government funding that supported the institute came with expectations that research would eventually benefit national security, and Elena's superiors had been intrigued by the potential military applications of her linguistic trigger theories. However, as her work progressed and her claims became more extraordinary, support began to wane. The institute's director, Dr. Harrison Blackwood, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the ethical implications of Elena's research and the potential for misuse. Elena's journal contained not just theoretical frameworks and experimental data, but also practical applications that she had tested in controlled environments. She had discovered that certain ancient languages contained natural trigger sequences that had been lost to time, explaining why some historical texts had been banned or destroyed by authorities who didn't fully understand their power. She had also developed entirely new trigger phrases using modern linguistic principles, combinations of sounds and rhythms that could influence human behavior with frightening precision. The most dangerous section of Elena's journal dealt with what she called termination sequences, minor specific word patterns that could theoretically force immediate cessation of aggressive behavior in individuals and groups. These weren't merely calming phrases or persuasive arguments, but precisely crafted linguistic structures that could override the brain's capacity for violence and aggression. Elena had theorized that if these sequences could be transmitted through mass communication channels during wartime, they could potentially end conflicts without firing a single shot. Dr. Harrison Blackwood paced nervously in his oak-paneled office, the weight of the decision before him pressing down like a physical force. 3 men in dark suits sat across from his desk, their expressions unreadable behind designer sunglasses despite the evening hour. The one in the center, who had introduced himself only as Agent Morrison, placed a thick manila folder on the desk between them. Dr. Blackwood, Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I trust you understand the gravity of what we're discussing here. Dr. Vasquez's research has moved beyond academic curiosity into territory that poses a legitimate threat to national security. Blackwood's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Elena's journal pages, obviously taken with sophisticated surveillance equipment. The images were so clear he could read her handwriting, see the intricate diagrams she had drawn to illustrate her theories about neurological pathways and linguistic triggers. More disturbing were the additional documents in the folder: intelligence reports from foreign agencies showing similar research being conducted in laboratories across Vanthia and the Moria. The 3 nations have been developing these linguistic weapons in parallel. The agent continued, his tone matter-of-fact despite the extraordinary nature of his words. Our intelligence suggests that Vanthia's program is approximately 18 months behind Dr. Vasquez's work, while the Moria's efforts are even more rudimentary. However, all 3 programs have reached the same disturbing conclusion. Whoever masters these techniques first will possess the ability to end this war on their terms. The implications hit Blackwood like a physical blow. He had always known Elena's work was controversial, but he had viewed it through the lens of pure academic research. The idea that her theories could actually be weaponized, that her journal contained practical instructions for linguistic mind control, had seemed like something out of science fiction. Yet here were government agents treating her work as a clear and present danger to international stability. Agent Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Dr. Vasquez doesn't fully comprehend what she's created. Her journal contains complete instructions for 17 different trigger sequences, including 3 that our psychologists believe could force immediate surrender in enemy combatants. If this information were to fall into the wrong hands, or if Dr. Vasquez were to defect to another nation, the balance of power in this conflict would shift dramatically. Blackwood found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What exactly are you asking me to do? Elena is a colleague, a brilliant researcher who's dedicated her life to understanding the human mind. I can't simply betray her trust because you're afraid of what her work might become. The second agent, who had remained silent until now, spoke with a slight accent that Blackwood couldn't identify. Dr. Blackwood, we're not asking you to betray anyone. We're asking you to help us protect Dr. Vasquez from forces that would exploit her research for devastating purposes. Our intelligence indicates that Vanthian operatives have already attempted to make contact with her. They've offered her unlimited funding, a state-of-the-art laboratory, and most temptingly, access to their database of recordings from Karelian prisoners of war. The mention of Karelian prisoners made Blackwood's stomach turn. He knew how much Elena blamed Vanthia for her brother's death, knew how desperately she wanted to understand the psychological factors that perpetuated the cycle of violence between the three nations. The offer of access to enemy interrogation records would be nearly irresistible to someone with her research interests and personal motivations. Morrison produced a second folder, this one containing surveillance photographs that made Blackwood's blood run cold. Elena was clearly visible in several images meeting with individuals in coffee shops and park benches. The photos were date-stamped from the previous week, showing that the surveillance had been ongoing for some time without Blackwood's knowledge. Dr. Vasquez has been in contact with foreign agents for at least 2 weeks, Morrison explained, his tone becoming more urgent. She hasn't accepted their offers yet, but our behavioral analysts believe she's seriously considering defection. The death of her brother has left her emotionally vulnerable, and the academic community's rejection of her work has made her desperate for validation and resources to continue her research. Blackwood studied the photographs more carefully, noting Elena's body language in each image. She did appear stressed and conflicted, frequently looking over her shoulder and checking her surroundings. In one photo, she was accepting an envelope from a man whose face was partially obscured by shadows. The timestamp showed the meeting had occurred just 2 days earlier. What we're proposing, the third agent finally, his voice carrying a slight electronic distortion that suggested the use of voice-changing technology, is a controlled operation to secure Dr. Vasquez's research before it can be compromised. We need her journal and all related materials to be transferred to a secure facility, where they can be properly evaluated, and if necessary, classified at the highest levels of government security. The plan they outlined was elegantly simple and morally complex. Blackwood would arrange for Elena to attend a special evening seminar at the Institute, ostensibly to present her latest findings to a select group of colleagues and potential investors. During this presentation, security personnel would execute a carefully choreographed scenario designed to make Elena believe the foreign agents were to distill her research. In the ensuing chaos, her journal and research materials would be secured and taken to a government facility for protection. Dr. Vasquez will be completely safe throughout the operation, Morrison assured him, though his eyes remained hidden behind his dark glow. She'll be debriefed by our specialists and given the opportunity to continue her research under government oversight. This isn't about destroying her work. It's about ensuring that it serves the interests of peace rather than being perverted into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Blackwood found himself caught between competing loyalties and conflicting moral imperatives. On one hand, Elena was a colleague and friend who deserved his support and protection. Her research, however controversial, represented a genuine attempt to understand the deepest mechanisms of human communication and consciousness. On the other hand, the possibility that her work could be used to manipulate and control human behavior on a massive scale was genuinely terrifying. If I agree to this, Blackwood said slowly, what guarantee do I have that Elena's research will be used responsibly? How do I know that you're not simply another group seeking to weaponize her discoveries for your own purposes? Morrison's smile was cold and utterly without warmth. Dr. Blackwood, the question isn't whether linguistic weapons will be developed. That process is already underway in multiple nations. The question is whether those weapons will be controlled by stable democratic institutions or by whoever happens to acquire the technology first. Dr. Vasquez's journal contains the most advanced research in this field currently in existence. We can either secure it properly, or we can watch as it falls into hands that will show no restraint in its application. Elena Vasquez sat alone in her cramped apartment, the leather journal open before her eyes. on a desk cluttered with coffee cups, linguistic textbooks, and printouts of brain scan imagery. The weight of 15 years of research seemed to emanate from the pages like heat from a fire, each word and diagram representing countless hours of painstaking work that the academic world had dismissed as fantasy. She turned to page 47, where her most dangerous discovery was recorded in her precise handwriting. The section was titled, Cascade Sequence Alpha 7, Mass Compliance Induction Through Auditory Transmission. Below the heading, Elena had documented the exact phonetic structure of a 23-word phrase that could theoretically force immediate obedience in anyone who heard it spoken with the correct tonal patterns and rhythmic emphasis. The phrase itself appeared innocuous when written in standard phonetic notation, but Elena knew that its power lay not in the meaning of the words, but in their precise acoustic properties. The sequence had been designed to bypass the brain's critical thinking centers and tap directly into the evolutionary mechanisms that had once helped human ancestors respond instantly to danger calls. When spoken correctly, the phrase triggered a neurological response that temporarily suppressed independent thought and created an overwhelming compulsion to follow the next instruction given by the speaker. Elena had discovered the theoretical framework for this sequence while studying recordings of historical speeches that had achieved seemingly impossible results. She had analyzed hours of audio from religious revivals where entire crowds had simultaneously fallen to their knees, political rallies where audiences had chanted slogans with unnaturally perfect synchronization, and military ceremonies where soldiers had displayed inhuman levels of coordination. In each case, she had identified subtle acoustic patterns that seemed to influence crowd behavior beyond what could be explained by normal social psychology. The breakthrough had come when Elena realized that human speech contained layers of information that most people processed unconsciously. Beyond the obvious semantic content of words, the brain also analyzed rhythm, pitch, harmonic overtones, and dozens of other acoustic features that could trigger emotional and physiological responses. By carefully mapping these hidden channels of communication, Elena had learned to craft phrases that carried multiple levels of meaning, some conscious, others operating below the threshold of awareness. Page 63 contained Anna's most ethically troubling discovery, Neural Override Protocol Delta 2. Long-term behavioral modification through repetitive exposure. This section detailed how specific word patterns could be embedded in ordinary conversation to gradually reshape a listener's beliefs and motivations over time. Unlike the immediate compliance sequences, these protocols work slowly and subtly, building new neural pathways through repeated exposure to carefully crafted linguistic structures. Elena had tested this protocol in limited trials with volunteer subjects, using innocuous suggestions like encouraging healthier eating habits or improved study techniques. The results had been remarkable. Subjects exposed to the embedded language patterns showed measurable behavioral changes within 2 weeks, despite having no conscious awareness that they were being influenced. The implications for advertising, education, and political messaging were staggering, but Elena had been more interested in the potential applications for conflict resolution. The journal's most classic section began on page 90 with the heading, Termination Protocols Linguistic Structures for Aggression Cessation. Elena had theorized that if language should trigger violent impulses, it should also be possible to use linguistic techniques to suppress them. Her research had identified 7 distinct phrase patterns that could theoretically force immediate cessation of aggressive behavior, even in individuals experiencing extreme emotional states. These termination protocols were based on Elena's analysis of historical peace negotiations and surrender ceremonies that had achieved unexpectedly rapid results. She had studied recordings of tribal conflicts that had ended abruptly after specific ritual phrases were spoken. Disputes that had been resolved through the intervention of particular mediators known for their magical ability to calm hostile crowds,
and military standoffs that had concluded without violence after the use of carefully chosen words by skilled negotiators.
Elena's most ambitious discovery was documented
On pages 112 through 127.
She called it the Universal Peace Protocols, a complex sequence of phrases that could
theoretically be transmitted through mass communication channels to simultaneously influence entire populations.
The protocol combined elements of the complex sequences, behavioral modification patterns, and aggression cessation triggers into a
unified linguistic structure that could in theory force immediate cessation of large-scale conflicts.
The Universal Peace Protocol was designed to be transmitted through radio broadcasts,
television programming, and internet communications, spreading through populations like a beneficial virus.
Unlike traditional propaganda, which relied on persuasion and emotional
manipulation, the protocol would work by directly interfacing with the neurological mechanisms that governed aggressive behavior.
Individuals exposed to the complete sequence would experience an immediate and overwhelming compulsion to end
any violent actions they were engaged in, regardless of their personal beliefs or motivations.
Elena had never tested the Universal Peace Protocol beyond computer simulations and
limited trials with individual subjects.
The ethical implications were staggering. Even if the protocol could end wars and save countless lives, it would also represent the ultimate
violation of human free will and autonomy.
The power to override individual choice and impose personal
phobias, isolations, was perhaps the most dangerous capability any individual or government could possess.
Her journal also contained detailed analysis of the three-way
conflict between Karelia, Venthia, and Demoria.
Elena had identified specific linguistic and cultural vulnerabilities in each nation's communication patterns that could be
exploited through targeted trigger sequences.
She had mapped the propaganda techniques used by each government, analyzed the speech patterns of their military
leaders, and identified the precise emotional triggers that each culture used to motivate their soldiers and citizens.
Most disturbingly, Elena had developed nation-specific termination
protocols that could theoretically force immediate surrender by targeting the unique psychological and cultural characteristics of each opposing force.
The Vanthian military she had discussed was particularly susceptible to phrases that challenged their collective identity and sense of historical purpose. Karelian forces could be influenced through linguistic patterns that triggered their deep-seated respect
for hierarchical authority.
The Morian troops responded most strongly to sequences that activated their
cultural emphasis on family loyalty and protection of homeland.
Elena closed the journal
and leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had created.
In her hands lay the power to end the decades-long conflict that had claimed her brother's life and devastated 3 nations. But that same power could just as easily be used to enslave minds,
overthrow governments, or reduce entire populations to mindless compliance.
The question that haunted her wasn't whether her discoveries
worked on masses. Her research had proven their effectiveness beyond doubt.
The question was whether any individual should possess such godlike
power over human consciousness.
As Elena sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, she had no idea that her journal was already the subject of intense
government interest.
That foreign agents were actively
attempting to recruit her, or that forces beyond her control were preparing to make the decision about her research's future for her.
Dr. Harrison Blackwood's hands shook as he dialed Elena's number, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. 3 days had passed since his meeting with the government agents, 3 days of sleepless nights and moral anguish as he wrestled with competing loyalties and impossible choices. The plan they had outlined seemed both elegant and monstrous, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to separate Elena from her research while maintaining the illusion that her safety and interests were being protected. "Elena, it's Harrison," he said when she answered, forcing his voice to remain steady and professional. "I have some remarkable news. I've been contacted by representatives from the International Institute for Cognitive Sciences. They've expressed serious interest in your linguistic trigger research and want to arrange a private presentation next week. Elena's surprise was evident in her voice. The IICS. Harrison, they've never shown any interest in my work before. Most of their board members have been among my harshest critics. Are you certain this isn't some kind of academic ambush designed to further discredit my research? Blackwood had anticipated her skepticism. The cover story had been carefully crafted by the government agents to appeal to Elena's desperate need for professional validation while providing a plausible explanation for the sudden interest in her controversial work. I understand your concerns, but the situation has changed dramatically. There have been developments in neuro-linguistic research at several major universities that have begun to validate your theoretical framework. The IICS board is apparently reconsidering their previous position on trigger sequence research. The lie came easier than Blackwood had expected, though each word felt like a betrayal of everything he claimed to value about academic integrity and collegial trust. They're particularly interested in your work on behavioral modification through linguistic structures. Apparently, their military consulting division has identified potential applications for peacekeeping operations in conflict zones. Elena's excitement was palpable even through the phone connection. After years of professional isolation and academic ridicule, the possibility of recognition from one of the world's most prestigious research institutions was almost too wonderful to believe. What kind of presentation are they looking for? Do they want a comprehensive overview of my research, or are they interested in specific applications? They want everything, Blackwood replied, following the script the agents had provided. Complete documentation of your trigger sequences, detailed analysis of your theoretical frameworks, and practical demonstrations of your techniques. They've arranged for a private evening session at the Institute next Friday. Very exclusive at just the IICS board members and a few select colleagues who've been following your work. Elena's voice carried a note of caution that made Blackwood's stomach churn with guilt. Harrison, this seems almost too good to be true. Why the sudden change in attitude? What's really going on here? Blackwood closed his eyes, hating himself for the manipulation he was about to employ. Elena, I think the academic community is finally beginning to understand the implications of your brother's death and the ongoing conflict between our three nations. There's a growing recognition that traditional diplomatic and military approaches have failed, and that new methods, perhaps including your linguistic techniques, may be necessary to achieve lasting peace. The mention of her brother was a calculated move designed to override Elena's natural skepticism by appealing to her deepest emotional motivations. Blackwood knew that Elena's research had always been driven by a desire to understand and prevent the kind of senseless violence that had claimed Marcus's life. The possibility that her work might actually be used to end the three-way conflict would be nearly irresistible to someone with her personal investment in the outcome. They want me to bring my journal, Elena asked, her voice now carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness. All of my research notes and experimental data, everything, Blackwood confirmed. They want to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of your work. Elena, this could be the breakthrough you've been working toward for 15 years. The opportunity to move your research from theoretical frameworks to practical applications that could actually save lives. Elena was quiet for several long moments, and Blackwood could almost hear her internal struggle between hope and suspicion. Finally, she spoke with the determination that had characterized her research career despite years of professional setbacks. I'll do it, Friday evening at the Institute. But Harrison, I want your personal guarantee that this is legitimate. If this turns out to be some kind of setup designed to humiliate me or steal my research, I'll never forgive you. Blackwood's throat felt dry as he gave her the assurance she needed. Elena, you have my word. This is a genuine opportunity for your work to receive the recognition and support it deserves. After ending the call, Blackwood immediately contacted Agent Morrison to confirm that Elena had accepted the invitation. The government operator's satisfaction was evident in his voice as he outlined the final details of the operation. Excellent work, Dr. Blackwood. Our technical team will have the Institute prepared Thursday evening. Dr. Vasquez will arrive Friday at 7 p.m. for what she believes will be a private presentation to the IICS board. Instead, she'll walk into a carefully controlled scenario designed to justify the immediate seizure of her research materials. Morrison explained that the operation would begin with Elena delivering the first portion of her presentation to a room filled with actors posing as distinguished academics and institute board members. Approximately 30 minutes into her presentation, security personnel would burst into the room claiming to have detected unauthorized foreign surveillance equipment in the building. In the ensuing chaos, Elena's journal and research materials would be secured as evidence and immediately transferred to a classified government facility. Vasquez will be temporarily detained for her own protection, Morrison continued, while our specialists conduct a thorough debriefing and evaluate the security implications of her research. She'll be told that foreign agents had infiltrated the presentation in an attempt to steal her work, and that government intervention was necessary to prevent a serious breach of national security. Blackwood found himself asking the question that had been haunting him since his initial meeting with the agents. What happens to Elena after you have her research? Will she be allowed to continue her work, or are you planning to bury everything she's discovered? Morrison's response was carefully neutral. Dr. Vasquez will be offered the opportunity to continue her research under government oversight, with appropriate security clearances and unlimited funding. Her discoveries are too valuable to ignore, but they're also too dangerous to leave in civilian hands. This operation represents the best possible outcome for everyone involved. National security is protected. Dr. Vasquez receives the support and recognition she deserves, and her work continues under proper supervision. The conversation ended with Morrison providing Blackwood with final instructions for his role in the deception. He was to arrive at the Institute early Friday evening to help prepare Elena for her presentation and ensure that she brought all of her research materials. Most importantly, he was to maintain his normal demeanor and avoid any behavior that might alert Elena to the true nature of the evening's events. As Friday approached, Blackwood found himself increasingly consumed by doubt and self-recrimination. He had convinced himself that he was acting in Elena's best interests, protecting her from foreign agents who would exploit her research for destructive purposes. But late at night, in the privacy of his own thoughts, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had become a collaborator in an elaborate betrayal of someone who trusted him completely. The stage was set for an evening that would irrevocably change Elena's life and determine the fate of research that could reshape the very nature of human conflict and cooperation. Elena arrived at the Institute for Advanced Linguistics precisely at 7 p.m., her leather journal tucked securely under her arm along with a briefcase containing 15 years of research documentation. The evening air was crisp and filled with the scent of autumn leaves, but she barely noticed the beauty of the campus as she walked toward what she believed would be the most important presentation of her career. The Institute's main conference room had been transformed for the occasion, with elegant lighting and a professional presentation setup that impressed Elena despite her nervousness. As she entered the room, she was greeted by faces she recognized from academic journals and conference proceedings. Distinguished researchers and institute board members whose approval could resurrect her career and validate years of controversial work. Dr. Harrison Blackwood approached her with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, though Elena noticed a slight tension around his eyes that seemed unusual. "Elena, wonderful to see you. Are you ready for this? The board members are quite eager to hear about your latest developments in trigger sequence research." Elena clutched her journal more tightly, feeling the weight of everything she had worked for condensed into the leather-bound volume. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Harrison. This feels surreal. After years of rejection and criticism, having the IICS board actually interested in my work seems like a dream." What Elena didn't know was that the board members seated around the conference table were carefully selected government agents and professional actors, each one briefed on her research and prepared to ask detailed questions that would demonstrate apparent expertise in neuro-linguistic theory. The real IICS board had no knowledge of the evening's events, and the Institute's regular security staff had been replaced by government operatives posing as routine personnel. Elena began her presentation with characteristic passion and precision, explaining the theoretical foundations of linguistic trigger sequences and their potential applications for conflict resolution. She opened her journal to reference specific examples, unaware that hidden cameras were recording every page she displayed, every diagram she explained, and every word of her groundbreaking research. The key breakthrough came when I realized that human consciousness processes language on multiple levels simultaneously. Elena explained, turning to page 34 of her journal. While we're consciously aware of semantic meaning, our brains are also analyzing acoustic patterns, rhythmic structures, and harmonic overtones that can influence behavior below the threshold of awareness. The fake board members asked sophisticated questions that demonstrated apparent familiarity with her work, praising her innovative approaches and expressing excitement about potential practical applications. For 30 minutes, Elena experienced the professional validation she had craved for over a decade, believing that her years of isolation and ridicule were finally coming to an end. Then the carefully orchestrated chaos began. At exactly 7:47 p.m., the conference room doors burst open and 6 men in dark tactical gear rushed into the room, shouting commands and brandishing what appeared to be sophisticated electronic equipment. Everyone on the ground. We have detected unauthorized surveillance devices in this building. This is a matter of national security. The fake board members reacted with perfectly calibrated alarm, some diving under the conference table while others stood frozen in apparent shock. Elena found herself paralyzed by confusion and terror as one of the tactical operatives approached her with what looked like a military-grade scanner. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from those documents immediately," the operative commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Our equipment has detected foreign electronic surveillance equipment targeting this room. Your research materials may have been compromised." Elena's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. "I don't understand. These are my private research notes. How could they be compromised? What kind of surveillance equipment?" Agent Morrison, now dressed in tactical gear but still recognizable to Dr. Blackwood, stepped forward with an expression of grim urgency. "Dr. Vasquez, we have intelligence indicating that foreign operatives have been monitoring your research activities for several weeks. This presentation was likely targeted as an opportunity to photograph or steal your work. We need to secure your materials immediately for analysis and protection." The room erupted in controlled chaos as the operatives began sweeping for electronic devices and questioning the fake board members about their backgrounds and security clearances. Elena watched in growing horror as one of the agents reached for her journal, the culmination of 15 years of painstaking research. "No," she exclaimed, clutching the journal to her chest. "You can't just take my work. These are my private research notes. I don't care what kind of surveillance you think was happening. This journal contains information that could revolutionize our understanding of human communication." Morrison's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand your concerns, but your research has implications for national security that go far beyond academic consideration. If foreign agents have gained access to your trigger sequence theories, they could weaponize your discoveries in ways that would destabilize international relations." Elena's desperation was genuine and heartbreaking. "Please, you don't understand what you're doing. This journal contains the only complete record of my work. If something happens to it, 15 years of research will be lost forever. There must be another way to handle this situation." But the operatives were already implementing the next phase of their plan. As Elena clutched her journal, one of the agents produced what appeared to be a portable incendiary device, explaining that immediate destruction of potentially compromised research materials was standard protocol in situations involving foreign. "Dr. Vasquez," Morrison said with apparent regret, "the safest course of action is to destroy these materials here and now, preventing any possibility of foreign. Your work is too dangerous to leave vulnerable to enemy agents." Elena's world collapsed as she realized what they intended. "You can't burn my journal. This research could end wars, could save thousands of lives. The trigger sequences I've documented could force immediate cessation of the conflict between Karelia, Vantilla, and the Moor." Her protests fell on deaf ears as the agents firmly but gently removed the journal from her grasp. Within moments, the leather-bound volume that contained her life's work was placed in a metal container along with her briefcase of supporting documentation. Elena watched in absolute horror as Morrison activated the incendiary device and dropped it into the container. The flames consumed everything with frightening efficiency. Elena's precise handwriting, her detailed diagrams of neural pathways, her maps of linguistic vulnerability. The smoke that rose from the container carried with it not just the destruction of academic research, but the elimination of discoveries that could have reshaped the very nature of human conflict. What none of the operatives realized, what Elena herself had never fully understood, was that her journal contained more than theoretical frameworks and experimental data. Hidden within her documentation of trigger sequences were what she had termed resonance patterns, linguistic structures so precisely calibrated that they could influence human behavior, even when reduced to their component smoke and dispersed through the air and absorbed unconsciously by anyone who breathed them. As the smoke from Elena's burning journal drifted through the Institute's ventilation system and out into the evening air, it began to carry her most powerful discoveries far beyond the confines of the conference room, beyond the campus and into the surrounding city where 3 nations' diplomatic representatives were gathered for what had been scheduled as routine peace negotiations. Dr. Isratus Tarberton Marcus Chen, Vantia's chief diplomatic negotiator, was reviewing preparation notes for the next morning's peace talks when the first wave hit him. He was seated in his hotel suite 12 blocks from the Institute for Advanced Linguistics, working by lamplight, as he often did to reduce eye strain, when an overwhelming sense of calm washed over him like warm water. The sensation was so unexpected and profound that Marcus set down his pen and looked around the room, wondering if someone had introduced some kind of gas into the ventilation system. His mind, which had been racing through complex diplomatic strategies and counter-arguments just moments before, suddenly felt crystal clear and focused in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. Marcus had been preparing for what he expected to be another futile round of negotiations between Karelia, Vantia, and the Moor. 23 years of warfare had created such deep animosity between the 3 nations that diplomatic sessions had become little more than formalized exchanges of accusations and threats. He had arrived in the neutral city of New Geneva with the same cynical expectations that had characterized every previous peace attempt. But now, sitting in his hotel room, as the autumn evening deepened around him, Marcus found himself experiencing something unprecedented. The anger that had driven his negotiating strategy for years, anger over Karelian territorial aggression, anger over the Mauryan resource monopolization, anger over the thousands of Vantian soldiers who had died, and a seemingly pointless conflict was simply gone. In its place was a clear understanding that the war had to end, not through victory or defeat, but through genuine reconciliation and mutual understanding. Marcus found himself remembering not the tactical advantages Vantia might gain through continued conflict, but the faces of refugees he had seen in border camps, the children who had grown up knowing nothing but violence and hatred, the families torn apart by decades of senseless fighting. 6 blocks away, Colonel Sarah Brennan of the Karelian military delegation was experiencing an identical transformation. She had been reviewing intelligence reports about Vantian troop movements when the sensation struck her. A sudden inexplicable shift in that made her previous military thinking seem not just wrong but incomprehensible. Sarah had built her career on tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty to Karelian strategic interests. She had been present at dozens of diplomatic sessions over the years, always as a military advisor whose job was to ensure that Karelia's negotiating positions maintained sufficient leverage to protect national security. Her brother officers considered her one of the most effective hardliners in the Karelian military. Yet as she sat in her temporary office reviewing classified documents, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on military advantages and strategic positioning. Instead, she was overwhelmed by the realization that every military action she had planned or supported had contributed to a cycle of violence that served no one's true. The tactical brilliance she had been so proud of suddenly seemed like elaborate intellectual exercise. Dr. Alexa's trigger sequences, dispersed through the smoke from her birth journal, were working exactly as her theoretical models had predicted they would. The resonance patterns embedded in her research had been designed to bypass conscious metastator as the microscopic part of stored destroyed work spread through the city. They were creating a field effect that influenced anyone who breathed them. In the Fomorian embassy compound, Ambassador Patricia Volkov was dictating a strategic to her home government about the futility of the upcoming negotiation when her voice simply stopped working, not from any physical ailment, but from a sudden inability to formulate the hostile language. The diplomat coming and Patricia had been the Mori's chief negotiator since the early days of the three-way conflict. Known throughout diplomatic circles for her razor-sharp intellect and Warsaw's intellect and absolute refusal to compromise on what she considered core national interests. Her reputation had been built on an ability to identify and exploit weaknesses in opposing negotiating positions while maintaining the Moria's advantage in natural resource control. But as she stood in her embassy office, looking out at the city lights of New Geneva, Patricia found herself unable to remember why those resources were worth fighting over. The strategic calculations that had dominated her thinking for 20 years seemed not just flawed, but actively harmful to the people she was supposed to be serving. For the first time in decades, she found herself thinking about the conflict from the perspective of ordinary citizens, rather than government officials. The transformation wasn't limited to the primary diplomatic representatives. Throughout the city, military attachés, intelligence operatives, media correspondents, and support staff from all three nations were experiencing similar shifts in consciousness. Hardened soldiers found themselves unable to maintain hostile attitudes toward enemy personnel. Intelligence analysts discovered that their reports on enemy capabilities seemed designed to perpetuate conflict rather than protect national security. What made the effect particularly powerful was that none of the affected individuals realized they were being influenced by external forces. Elena's trigger sequences had been designed to feel like natural insights and emotional evolution rather than imposed behavioral changes. Each person experiencing the transformation believed they were simply seeing the situation more clearly than they had before. The phenomenon wasn't limited to diplomatic and military personnel. Hotel staff, restaurant workers, taxi drivers, and other civilians who had been exposed to the dispersed particles began experiencing similar effects. Throughout New Geneva, people who had previously held strong opinions about the three-way conflict found themselves unable to maintain hostile attitudes toward any of the warring nations. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, still at the Institute for Advanced Linguistics dealing with the aftermath of Elena's journal destruction, was among the first to realize that something extraordinary was happening. As he spoke with the government agents who had orchestrated the evening's events, he found himself increasingly disturbed by what they had done. Agent Morrison, Blackwood said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him, "I think we may have made a terrible mistake, Dr. Vasquez's research wasn't just theoretical. There may have been practical applications embedded in her documentation that we didn't fully understand." Morrison dismissed his concerns with the same bureaucratic efficiency he had displayed throughout the operation. Dr. Blackwood, the materials have been destroyed, and Dr. Vasquez is in protective custody. The threat to national security. Whatever theoretical applications her research might have contained are no longer relevant. But Blackwood was experiencing the same transformation that was affecting people throughout the city. The moral compromise he had made to facilitate Elena's betrayal suddenly seemed not just wrong but incomprehensible.
The idea that her research represented a threat to anyone seemed absurd when compared to the obvious threat posed by the continued warfare between three nations that should have been natural allies. Morrison Blackwood said with growing urgency, "We need to contact the diplomatic delegations immediately. Something is happening that goes beyond our original intelligence assessments. Dr. Vasquez's work may have been more advanced than any of us realized."
By dawn the next morning, the effects of Elena's dispersed trigger sequences had spread far beyond the diplomatic quarter of New Geneva. The microscopic particles from her burned journal had been carried by wind currents and ventilation systems throughout the city, creating an expanding zone of influence that affected thousands of people who had no direct connection to the three-way conflict. The first official indication that something unprecedented was occurring came at 6:47 a.m. when Colonel Sarah Brennan of the Karelian delegation placed an emergency call to her commanding officer, General Robert Hayes, at military headquarters in the Karelian capital. General Sarah's voice was steady but carried an urgency that Hayes had never heard from his most reliable field commander. "I need to report a significant development in my assessment of our negotiating position. After reviewing our strategic objectives overnight, I believe we need to fundamentally reconsider our approach to these peace talks." General Hayes, who was drinking his morning coffee while reviewing overnight intelligence reports, initially assumed that Sarah had identified some tactical advantage that Karelia could exploit in the negotiations. "What kind of development, Colonel? Have you discovered something about Vanthian or the Morian capabilities that changes our position?" Sarah's response was unlike anything Hayes had heard in 30 years of military service. "General, I believe our entire strategic framework has been counterproductive. The resources we've been fighting over, the territorial disputes we've been trying to resolve through military action, none of it justifies the human cost we've inflicted on all three nations. I think we need to enter these negotiations with a genuine commitment to ending this war permanently." The silence that followed lasted nearly 15 seconds. General Hayes had personally selected Sarah for the diplomatic mission because of her unwavering commitment to Karelian military objectives and her reputation for tactical ruthlessness. The woman speaking to him now sounded like a completely different person. "Colonel Brennan," Hayes said carefully, "are you feeling well? Has there been any indication of chemical agents or psychological warfare tactics being employed against our delegation?" Sarah's laugh was genuine and without any trace of the cynicism that had characterized her military career. "General, I've never felt clearer in my life. I think we've been approaching this conflict from a perspective that serves no one's actual interests. The strategic advantages we've been pursuing have cost us more than they could ever be worth." Similar conversations were taking place simultaneously in Vanthian and the Morian military commands. Dr. Marcus Chen had contacted his foreign ministry at 6:23 a.m. to request immediate authorization to offer comprehensive territorial concessions that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. Ambassador Patricia Volkov had awakened her sleeping government officials with proposals for resource-sharing agreements that her diplomatic colleagues described as political suicide. At the Institute for Advanced Linguistics, Agent Morrison was fielding increasingly frantic calls from intelligence agencies representing all three warring nations. Each agency was reporting the same impossible phenomenon. Their diplomatic and military representatives in New Geneva had apparently experienced simultaneous psychological breaks that left them advocating for immediate peace settlements. "Morrison, Dr. Blackwood said as he burst into the agent's temporary command center, "You need to understand what we've done." Elena's journal didn't just contain theoretical research. It contained practical applications that have somehow survived the destruction of her written work. Morrison looked up from a bank of communication equipment that was buzzing with incoming calls from concerned government officials. "Dr. Blackwood, that's impossible. We destroyed Dr. Vasquez's materials completely. Whatever psychological effects you think you're observing must have some other explanation." Blackwood's frustration was evident as he tried to explain what he was beginning to understand about Elena's work. The trigger sequences weren't just written instructions, they were embedded in the physical structure of her documentation. "When we burned her journal, we didn't destroy her research, we activated it and dispersed it throughout the city." The full scope of what was happening became clear when Morrison received a call from his superior, Deputy Director Catherine Walsh, at 7:15 a.m. "Morrison, I need a complete briefing on your operation at the Institute for Advanced Linguistics." We're receiving reports of unprecedented behavioral changes among diplomatic personnel from all three warring nations. What exactly did you do with Dr. Vasquez's research? Morrison's confidence began to crack as he realized that the operation he had considered a complete success might have triggered consequences far beyond anyone's anticipation. Director Walsh, we followed the plan exactly as outlined. Dr. Vasquez's journal and all related materials were destroyed to prevent foreign acquisition. The target was secured and is currently in protective custody. Morrison Walsh's voice carried a tone of barely controlled alarm. The president of Karelia just contacted our embassy requesting immediate bilateral talks about ending the three-way conflict. The Vanthian Prime Minister has announced that he's prepared to make territorial concessions that his government has refused to consider for over 2 decades. The Thorian Parliament is holding an emergency session to authorize resource-sharing agreements that they've never even discussed in closed sessions. The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. If Elena's research had somehow survived its destruction and was now affecting diplomatic personnel throughout the city, the carefully controlled operation to secure her work had instead resulted in the uncontrolled release of linguistic weapons more powerful than anyone had imagined. Director Walsh, Morrison said, his voice now carrying genuine concern, we may need to implement emergency containment protocols. If Dr. Vasquez's trigger sequences are somehow airborne and affecting cognitive function throughout New Geneva, we could be looking at a situation that threatens international stability. Walsh's response was immediate and decisive. Morrison, I want Dr. Vasquez released from custody immediately and brought to your location. If her research is still active in some form, she may be the only person who understands how to control or reverse its effects. And Morrison wished this conversation is now classified at the highest possible level. If word of this situation reaches the media, it could trigger panic that makes our current problems look trivial. As government agencies scrambled to understand what was happening in New Geneva, the affected diplomatic personnel were proceeding with the scheduled peace negotiations as if nothing unusual had occurred. From their perspective, they were simply approaching the talks with a clarity and wisdom that had been missing from previous diplomatic efforts. At 8:30 a.m., the three chief negotiators were Dr. Marcus Chen, Colonel Sarah Brennan, and Ambassador Patricia Volkov met in the conference room where 23 years of failed peace talks had taken place. But instead of the usual formal protocols and hostile positioning, they greeted each other with genuine warmth and a shared commitment to ending the conflict that had devastated their nations. I want to begin, Dr. Chen said as the session opened, by acknowledging that Vanthia has made strategic errors throughout this conflict that have caused unnecessary suffering for all three nations. We're prepared to discuss comprehensive territorial adjustments that prioritize human welfare over political advantage. The statement would have been considered treason by Vanthian military command just 24 hours earlier, but Chen delivered it with complete conviction and sincerity. Elena Vasquez was escorted back to the Institute for Advanced Linguistics at 9:15 a.m., her hands still trembling from the shock of witnessing her life's work reduced to ashes. The government agents who had held her overnight for protective custody had been professional but evasive about the true nature of the security threat that had allegedly justified the destruction of her research. As she entered the familiar conference room where her presentation had been so violently interrupted, Elena was struck by the surreal contrast between the morning's calm atmosphere and the previous evening's chaos. Dr. Blackwood was waiting for her, along with Agent Morrison and several other officials she didn't recognize, all of whom appeared to be experiencing varying degrees of stress and confusion. Elena Blackwood began, his voice carrying a note of urgency she had never heard before. We need to understand exactly what was contained in your journal. Not just the theoretical frameworks but any practical applications or embedded techniques that might have survived the destruction of your written materials. Elena's confusion was genuine and profound. Harrison, I don't understand what you're asking. My journal contained 15 years of research documentation, theories, experimental results, linguistic analyses. It was all destroyed last night. There's nothing left to analyze or understand. Agent Morrison stepped forward, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious concern. Dr. Vasquez, we're experiencing unusual behavioral patterns among diplomatic personnel throughout the city. Individuals who have been negotiating in bad faith for decades are suddenly displaying unprecedented cooperation and willingness to compromise. We need to know if your research contained any mechanisms that could explain these changes. Elena's mind raced as she tried to process what Morrison was telling her. You're saying that people in the city are behaving differently. In what way? How many people are affected? Blackwood handed her a tablet displaying news feeds from local media outlets. The headlines were extraordinary breakthrough in three-way peace talks, diplomatic miracle. In New Geneva, historic concessions offered by all parties. Elena read with growing amazement as she learned that the peace negotiations she had followed pessimistically for years were suddenly showing signs of genuine progress. Elena, Blackwood said gently, we think the destruction of your journal may have somehow activated or dispersed the trigger sequences you had documented. Is it possible that your research contained elements that could influence behavior even when reduced to smoke and particles? The question triggered a memory that made Elena's blood run cold. She remembered a theoretical framework she had developed but never fully tested, the concept of molecular resonance patterns embedded in the physical structure of written documentation. The idea had been so speculative, so far beyond anything she could verify with available equipment, that she had included it in her journal more as a thought experiment than as a practical. Elena whispered, sinking into a chair as the full implications began to dawn on her. The resonance patterns. I theorized that trigger sequences could be embedded in the molecular structure of ink and paper, that they could maintain their effectiveness even when the physical medium was altered or destroyed. Morrison's voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic. Dr. Vasquez, please explain exactly what you mean by resonance patterns. How would this work? What kind of effects would it produce? Elena's hands shook as she tried to explain research that she herself had only partially understood. I hypothesized that certain linguistic structures could be encoded not just as written symbols but as molecular patterns that would resonate at specific frequencies. When paper and ink are burned, they release particles that could theoretically carry these patterns into the air, where they could be absorbed through respiratory systems and processed by the brain below the level of conscious awareness. The room fell silent as everyone present realized the magnitude of what Elena was describing. If her theoretical framework was correct, the destruction of her journal hadn't eliminated her research. It had transformed it into an airborne agent that was now affecting thousands of people throughout New Geneva. The Universal Peace Protocol, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she began to understand what had happened. It was the most advanced sequence I had developed as a comprehensive linguistic structure designed to force immediate cessation of aggressive behavior in large populations. I embedded the complete protocol in the final section of my journal, using molecular encoding techniques as a backup preservation method. Agent Morrison's communication device began buzzing with incoming calls from government agencies around the world. Dr. Vasquez, we need to know everything about this Universal Peace Protocol. How long will its effects last? Can it be reversed? Are there any dangerous side effects we should be concerned about? Elena closed her eyes, trying to recall the theoretical parameters she had calculated for the protocol. The effects should last approximately 72 hours in most subjects, assuming normal metabolic processing of the airborne particles. The protocol was designed to be temporary and self-limiting, gradually wearing off as the resonance patterns are filtered out of the bloodstream. She paused, struggling with the ethical implications of what she was revealing. As for side effects, the protocol works by temporarily suppressing the neurological mechanisms that generate and sustain aggressive impulses. Subjects should experience enhanced empathy, improved capacity for rational decision-making, and dramatically reduced susceptibility to emotional manipulation or tribal thinking. Dr. Blackwood leaned forward, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and concern. Elena, you're describing the artificial creation of a population-wide psychological transformation. The diplomatic breakthroughs we're seeing aren't the result of changed circumstances or new. They're the result of your research literally rewiring how these people process conflict and aggression. Elena nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the full scope of what her work had accomplished. The Universal Peace Protocol was designed to break the cycle of retaliatory violence that perpetuates long-term conflicts. By temporarily removing the capacity for aggressive thinking, it creates a window of opportunity for rational problem-solving and genuine reconciliation. Morrison's next question cut to the heart of the situation's complexity. Dr. Vasquez, if the effects are temporary, What happens when they wear off? Will the affected individuals return to their previous attitudes and behaviors? Could this temporary peace actually make the long-term situation worse? Elena had agonized over this exact question during her years of research. The protocol doesn't just suppress aggressive impulses, it creates new neural pathways that support cooperative thinking and empathetic understanding. While the immediate effects are temporary, the insights and emotional connections formed during the influence period should persist even after the biochemical effects fade. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at a city where her life's work was conducting the greatest real-world experiment in the history of cognitive science. The people experiencing the protocol's effects will remember what it feels like to approach conflicts without hatred and fear. They'll remember what it's like to see their enemies as fellow human beings with legitimate concerns and needs. Those memories should provide a foundation for lasting behavioral change. Agent Morrison was receiving reports from field operatives throughout the city, all confirming that the peace negotiations were proceeding with unprecedented success. Dr. Vasquez, the diplomatic representatives have reached preliminary agreements on territorial disputes that have been deadlocked for over 2 decades. They're discussing resource-sharing arrangements that their governments have never considered. If your protocol is responsible for these breakthroughs, we may be witnessing the end of a war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her research, the work that had cost her career, her reputation, and nearly her sanity, had finally achieved its ultimate purpose. Her brother Marcus had died fighting in a war that might now end not through victory or defeat, but through At 2:30 p.m. on the second day of the protocol's effects, the situation in New Geneva took a dramatic turn that no one had anticipated. While the 3 primary diplomatic delegations continued their historic peace negotiations, unprecedented success, reports began flooding in from the capital cities of all 3 warring nations describing a crisis that threatened to undermine everything that had been accomplished. General Robert Hayes, commanding officer of Karelian military forces, was the first to recognize the magnitude of the threat. As he reviewed the communications he had received from Colonel Sarah Brennan over the past 24 hours, he realized that his most trusted field commander was advocating for concessions that would effectively surrender strategic advantage Karelia had spent decades developing. "This is unacceptable," Hayes declared during an emergency meeting of the Karelian Defense Council. Colonel Brennan has clearly been compromised by enemy psychological warfare. Her recommendations would leave Karelia vulnerable to future aggression from both Vanthia and the Moria. Similar concerns were being raised in military and political circles throughout all 3 nations. Government officials who had not been exposed to Elena's dispersed protocol were viewing the sudden diplomatic breakthroughs with deep suspicion and alarm. To them, the willingness of their representatives to make unprecedented concessions looked like evidence of coercion, blackmail, or enemy mind control. The Vanthian Prime Minister, Dmitry Volkov, called an emergency session of Parliament to address what he characterized as the apparent psychological compromise of our diplomatic mission. Speaking to a packed chamber in the Vanthian capital, Volkov expressed concerns that would soon be echoed by leadership in all 3 nations. The concessions being offered by our representatives in New Geneva are so far beyond anything we have previously considered that we must assume they are operating under some form of external influence, Volkov announced. No rational analysis of our national interests could justify the territorial adjustments and resource-sharing agreements that Dr. Chen is apparently willing to accept. In the Moria, similar emergency sessions were convening as government officials struggled to understand how Ambassador Patricia Volkov could have abandoned negotiating positions that had been fundamental to the Morian policy for over 20 years. The resource-sharing agreement she was proposing would fundamentally alter the Moria's economic advantages in ways that seemed to serve no conceivable national interest. At the Institute for Advanced Linguistics, Elena was monitoring these developments with growing horror. What she had hoped would be a breakthrough toward lasting peace was instead triggering a backlash that could lead to an escalation of the conflict beyond anything the 3 nations had previously experienced. "They think their representatives have been brainwashed," Elena said to Dr. Blackwood and Agent Morrison as they watched news feeds from all 3 capitals.
The governments are interpreting the diplomatic breakthroughs as evidence of enemy manipulation rather than genuine progress toward peace. Morrison was fielding urgent calls from intelligence agencies around the world, all demanding explanations for the unprecedented behavioral changes they were observing in New Geneva. Dr. Vasquez were receiving reports that military commanders in all three nations are considering recall orders for their diplomatic missions. If they withdraw their representatives before any agreements can be finalized, this entire situation could collapse into chaos. The situation became critical when General Hayes announced that Karelian military forces were being placed on high alert in response to what he characterized as evidence of sophisticated psychological warfare being conducted against our diplomatic personnel. Within hours, Vantian and the Morian military commands had issued similar alerts, creating a three-way military standoff that was more dangerous than anything that had existed before Helena's protocol took effect. We have less than 24 hours before the protocol's effects begin to fade, Elena explained, her voice tight with anxiety. If the peace agreements aren't finalized and signed before the diplomatic representatives return to their normal psychological states, this window of opportunity will close permanently. Worse, the military buildup that's occurring in response to the current situation could lead to a resumption of hostilities that's more devastating than anything we've seen before. Agent Morrison's communication equipment was buzzing with incoming reports from field operatives around the world. Dr. Vasquez, our intelligence indicates that all three nations are preparing for the possibility that their diplomatic missions have been compromised by enemy action. Military assets are being repositioned for potential offensive operations. If this situation continues to escalate, we could be looking at a three-way war that makes the previous conflict look like a minor border dispute. Elena felt the weight of global crisis pressing down on her as she realized that her life's work might have inadvertently triggered the very catastrophe she had spent 15 years trying to prevent. There has to be something we can do. The protocol is working exactly as designed. The diplomatic representatives are making rational decisions based on genuine understanding of their mutual interests, but their governments are interpreting this rationality as evidence of external manipulation. Dr. Blackwood, who had been monitoring communications between the diplomatic teams and their home governments, brought Elena a transcript that made her blood run cold. Elena, you need to see this. General Hayes has issued orders for Colonel Brennan to be taken into protective custody the moment she returns to Karelian territory. Similar orders have been issued by Vantian and the Morian military commands for their representatives. Elena read the transcript with growing despair. The diplomatic breakthrough that should have ended decades of warfare was instead being interpreted as evidence of the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation in military history. The very success of her protocol was being used to justify preparations for an even more devastating conflict. Agent Moore, Elena said with sudden determination, I need to speak directly with the diplomatic representatives while they're still under the protocol's influence. They need to understand what's happening to them and why their governments are reacting with such alarm. If they can explain the transformation in terms that their leadership will accept, we might be able to prevent this situation from spiraling out of control. Morrison shook his head firmly. Dr. Vasquez, that's absolutely impossible. If we reveal that their behavioral changes are the result of artificial influence, it will destroy any credibility the peace agreements might have. The governments are already suspicious. Confirmation that the representatives have been subjected to mind controls will guarantee a complete breakdown of negotiations. Elena's frustration was evident as she struggled with the impossible paradox her research had created. But if we don't explain what's happening, the military buildup will continue and we'll end up with a war that's worse than anything that came before. The protocol was designed to create a window for peace, not to trigger an escalation of hostilities. The clock was ticking toward a crisis that could reshape the geopolitical landscape of the entire region. Elena's Universal Peace Protocol had achieved everything she had theorized it could accomplish. The diplomatic representatives were operating with unprecedented clarity and cooperation, making rational decisions based on genuine understanding of their mutual interests. But the very success of her work was being interpreted as evidence of enemy action, triggering military preparations that could lead to a conflict more devastating than anything the three nations had ever experienced. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.